We're with the Virginia Department of Forestry doing the Envirothon training here. So the first 3 learning objectives, this is kind of that hard biology area. So it's kind of the difference between forest and grassland soils, the difference between photosynthesis and respiration, and the difference between growth cycles and cycles of the trees. So next. So we're going to kind of start off with just the basics of roots. So this right here, this is an open grown tree. This is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with tree form in general, but so trees that are grown in the open often spread out like this. They don't have anything growing up next to them. They spread out really far. And you'll notice that all this root tissue is actually staying up on that surface. And so tree roots often stay within the first 3 feet of the surface. Up to maybe 6 feet. That's where a lot of the gas exchange occurs. And so they will go out possibly hundreds of feet for a tree this large that's open grown. If it has the space, it'll spread out. And so, yeah, all that gas exchange will go next. That brings us into kind of the difference between forest vegetation, roots and soils versus grassland vegetation and the roots and the soils. If you look on the right hand there, you'll see that forest land versus that left hand, you'll see that grassland. The grassland has that A1 and that A2, and those are that highly organic zones in the soil, versus the forest section has a very small organic zone, but it also has this kind of what we call an O section on top, and that's generally going to be a lot of leaves. And you'll notice some big differences here. Is with all that organic matter accumulating, that actually is a lot of that nutrients is accumulating up on that that grassland, while in the forest a lot of those nutrients are cycling upwards more towards those roots. They're being kind of upcycled, so you get this kind of loss in this E section here. We'll go next. There we go. So these is kind of the really basic, how do trees grow? So the biggest thing is there's meristems are the only point at which growth occurs in trees. And these are what we call buds. And so roots and shoots all have these buds on them, and they made of cortex, epidermis, and lateral buds. And so these can either become shoots or leaves or flowers. Eventually they'll all become kind of eventually the twiggy ones will eventually become branches, and so that's all the primary meristem. And then we get these secondary meristems, and these grow outwards. So the primary meristem's kind of shooting upwards almost always, and the secondaries are always growing outwards. And there's going to be a diagram right after this to show you about this, where I'll explain a little bit more. But primary meristems always go up, and that's leaves and flowers, while secondary meristems you'll think of getting wider. And that's often building up wood and aka xylem and the phloem. You're getting that parenchyma and that fiber. So a lot of that that tissue growth that you kind of notice, think of when you think of trees, is that secondary meristem, but that height is coming from the primary. Next. So here is our drawing. That little star there is the bud. The blue part is kind of, imagine this being a twig. And then give me a click here. That primary meristem grows upwards. And so we have the new primary meristem at the top that grew upwards. And then we imagine, so there's some secondary meristems in that blue bell curve at the bottom there. If you'll give me another click. And so we see that that grew outwards, and so that secondary meristem put on some width, while that primary meristem shot upwards. And that's kind of how the meristems work. They're the only sites of growth. All right, let's see. So types of tissue in a tree. So we got meristems, which are capable of cell division, which we were just talking about. Primary buds and roots, shoots, leaves, all of those things that are growing out of those primary meristems, and the secondary ones being that phloem and xylem. Let's see, where am I? So vessel elements and tracheids. So there's these little tiny holes in the wood, are these kind of wood tubes called vessel elements. These little wood holes and the phloem both conduct water and nutrients from roots to the crown. So they all go up in the phloem, and they move phosphonate. Yeah. Let's see. Ground. Let's see. So fibers in the stems are generally dead cells. A lot of these parenchyma and defense chemicals and kind of that outermost skin. You're thinking about a lot of just kind of, well, yeah, as it describes there, everything else is ground, while the vascular tissue is that stuff that's really conducting the nutrients. Let's go next. I think I have something on. Let's see. Yes. Okay. So here we can get into kind of that cross section. So if you look at the tree here, we got these on the left picture. You can see kind of, it's not the greatest. You can kind of see some rings there. And you can see these just kind of lines coming straight out from the center. Those are, well, those are technically cracks, but a lot of them are probably occurring along the rays, which are this vascular tissue that we'll get into. And on the right, it's kind of a breakdown of all the layers that you had to get through to get to this this cross section. So you start with that outer bark, what we call cork cambium. Then you go into the phloem. There is that, and then you get that, and that phloem is conducting those nutrients. And then you're getting that cambium. That cambium is that secondary meristem, and that's generally 1 to 2 cells thick. It's that really thin layer, and that's where a lot of that outward growth is occurring. Then you're getting that sapwood xylem and that heartwood xylem, and that's where you're getting conducting your water downwards. Let's see. Let's go next. Here we go. That's what I was looking for. Let's see. So the xylem is the wood of the tree. So the xylem is kind of that inner part here inside. Lindsey, are you able to put your mouse right over about the phloem arrow there? Maybe a little bit to the left, right at that divide. Yeah, so everything to the left of the mouse there is that xylem, and everything to the right of that is going to be kind of your phloem, your bark, your meristems. And your xylem consists of your vessel elements, your fibers, your parenchyma, and your parenchymal rays. And these are all, the rays are live tissue, the fibers dead tissue, and the vessel elements are little holes that are conducting in big tubes, conducting water. And so this is, so we're starting from the bark on the right, and it's moving inwards towards the core of the tree. So that bark goes in a couple inches, and then you're going to hit that that phloem. That phloem's conducting your nutrients, that live tissue, and then you're going to hit that cambium that's pushing outwards and growing width, and that's just that 1 to 2 cells in between that xylem and phloem. And then that xylem is all of that interior stuff, with exclusion, I suppose, that dead tissue. And this is all in a water oak. So oaks have these very distinct parenchymal rays, as we were seeing. A lot of non-oak species won't have these big distinct rays shooting through them. It'll just kind of be rings without these long extra pieces. This helps actually oaks be so hard. So next. Oh, one more. Let's see. So here's a really basic energy outline here. So plants create sugars through photosynthesis. They produce basic glucose, you know, take in water, sunlight, and nutrients, and you produce sugars. And those sugars are then, the sugar, water, and nutrients are moved through the plant in that vascular system. So xylem and phloem moving things. And then you get those living cells in the parenchyma and the meristem. Those sites of growth are going to burn that energy and use it to create cells. The Krebs cycle, you're producing ATP, you're growing your cells, you're doing all sorts of cellular respiration. And then, so we go into the blue part here, and the ATP fuels the production of defense chemicals. So you're thinking like in a pine, you have like all this sap and these kind of those smelly chemicals. If you ever know that pine smell, some of those are defense chemicals. So these new tissues, these defense chemicals, and you're also just repairing old cells. And then you get the photosynthesis taking place in the parenchyma. That kind of green vascular tissue underneath that bark can also actually do a little bit of photosynthesis. Let's see, we'll move on to the next slide. So here's a nice picture of a red bud. So you can see everything from, yeah, you can see everything from kind of the bud on the very left to the cork cambium, kind of the bark there. So we have the flowers. Flowers being produced by the one of the primary meristems. Fruits are simply flowers. Leaves are again going to be produced by that primary meristem. And then we got these pollinators hitting up the leaves, and then these shoots are actually going to be, you're thinking of the leaf and then a shoot, and then it expands. So a lot of that action is going to be on the secondary meristem. All right, we'll go next again. So I went kind of hard and fast on the biology, just in the interest of time. Feel free to reach out if you have any more questions. In fact, actually, feel free to ask any questions about the biology right now. We'll get those since we're at the end of that. I'll give about a minute or two to populate those if we have any.
If you were going to ask a question about biology on the Envirothon test, what might that look like?
So it might be something like the primary meristem is responsible for growth in what direction, while the secondary meristem does it in what direction. Or it might be which of these are live tissues, and you could think parenchyma and parenchymal rays are live tissue, and the meristems are live tissue, while maybe like the fibers and those ground tissues would not be. Let's see. It might also just be truly, it could just be a diagram of a wood cookie, and it could say label the parts, and it could be everything from that cork cambium inwards.
Okay, thank you. And we had a student asking if you could explain what a secondary meristem is again.
Oh, yes. Okay. Lindsay, are you able to back up to that wood cross section with all the arrows? Actually, maybe that one doesn't. Actually, we'll go back one more too. Yeah, that one. That's a good one for it. Okay, so the secondary meristem. So when you come in from the bark, if you look on that picture on the right, you get the bark on the very right, and then you got that phloem is that second piece, and then that cambium right there is that secondary meristem. So coming in from the bark, you're going to have that. It's these latent buds, as we call them. They're these buds that are underneath the bark inside the tree, and they grow outwards. They're like a cell or two thick, and they just kind of push outwards, growing. And then that tissue slowly turns into sapwood, heartwood, or phloem, differentiates depending on which side it's going to. And slowly you'll expand that tree ring, creating these big rings that we know as tree rings. Every year that kind of expands outwards. And so that's all created by that secondary meristem. While that primary meristem is like on the end of that twig or at the tip of that tree, and it's always pushing up. Let's see, ground tissues. Are we able to go to slide 7? Yes, that's one. So these ground tissues, a lot of them are going to be the dead tissues. let's see, parenchyma. Well, that's so some of those are live tissues, but so think of like those. How's the best way to describe this? Truly, we think of it as everything else. So the vessel elements and the phloem and those things that are conducting all these nutrients and water and things, those are the vascular elements because they are vascularized, they're moving stuff. And then we got the meristems, which are the things actually growing. So you have the growth cells, the things that are kind of hollow tubes moving things. And then you have ground tissues, which are just everything that is not one of those two pretty much. So that's the wood fibers, kind of these dead fibers, the parenchyma, which is that like ray thing that was coming out labeled in that one diagram. We can go to that after this. And then that epidermal, which is like that single cell on the edge right underneath the bark, controlling gas exchange. If we can go to slide 9, I'm going to point out some ground fibers. So that parenchyma, those are some ground tissues, and the fiber in between those parenchyma, the parenchyma being that light tissue, the fiber being that dark tissue inside. And that epidermal area kind of being that very, very outer part of the bark there. Yeah, there we go. So that's all kind of a ground tissue. Let's see. Awesome. Cool. All right. Do we have any more questions on the biology? Great. We'll move into forest ecology. All right. So basic learning objectives here is the forest structure. That one's going to be pretty easy, I think, to understand. Crown classes. And then so forest ecology concepts. So this is going to be relationship between soil and forest types and tree communities and regeneration. And then biotic and abiotic factors, which I think we'll get pretty easily. All right, next. So crown class. The best way to think about a crown class is to think about your tree as a cube here. Kind of draw your tree as a little cube. So to define what this kind of slide means, a dominant tree, actually, let's go to the next slide and then we'll move back to this one. So if we look at this dominant tree, if you think about this as a cube, so it's got that 4 or 5 sides exposed to the sun. All right, so if and you see the codominant tree only has 2 or 3 sides of it exposed to the sun, while the intermediate there only has the very top, so it's only 1 side. We'll actually move back a slide. So our dominant tree, if you're thinking it as a cube, it's got all 4 or 5, because the underside is definitely not exposed to the sun. So it's got 4 or 5 of those open sides that it has exposed to the sun, while a codominant likely has maybe the top and 2 sides, and an intermediate generally only has the top exposed. While the suppressed generally is just underneath the middle thing and it's all the way at the bottom. So I guess we'll move on to that next slide again, just to give you, so those shrubs are kind of, those aren't technically suppressed because they're shrubs, but if those were trees, those would be suppressed like that one down there because there's no light getting into that. Meanwhile, that intermediate's only getting light from the top half, and that codominant's kind of getting 2 sides and a top maybe, and that dominant's getting, I think in this one, it's getting about 4 or 5 sides. I'd say about 4 on this one. And so that's how you do crown classes. It's kind of that, you just kind of got to memorize those numbers and work it through. All right, next. All right, so abiotic factors. I guess this is slightly out of order from the learning objectives, but we'll fix that later. So abiotic factors, we got sunlight, carbon dioxide, oxygen, water, nutrients, temperature, fire, and stress. So we have all these abiotic factors. These are all, so the stress comes a lot from it's like shifting conditions kind of building up of these abiotic factors leading to favoring other species. It's kind of loosely that one's not so much well defined. But the fire, so a fire runs through, it burns all the trees down. It's not living, fire's not living. So that's going to reduce reduce competition, create mortality events for all the trees that are not fire adapted. It'll prep the seed bed, so anything that's like got a waxy coating on the seed and needs that kind of burn, it'll be ready to that. So we get temperature, so like some seeds won't germinate until specific temperatures, all those kinds of things. Some seeds need to last over an entire winter and be frozen before they will actually germinate. Nutrients, so we have, I mean, think back to kind of that soil of the forest. We get that weathering bedrock turning into that E layer, and that kind of clay, thick layer, and then it moves into that organic layer. So that kind of decaying matter and that weathering bedrock material coming together. And that really determines on your site how well the tree's going to grow, the amount of nutrients. That's an abiotic factor. Water, of course, we need water to complete photosynthesis. Oxygen, trees do need to respirate. They need to do cellular respiration. So oxygen is very needed. CO2, not really a limiting factor ever, but it is an abiotic factor, technically. Sunlight, so thinking back to that whole idea of crown classes, this is an abiotic limiting factor that even helps us determine trees and forest management there. We'll go to the next slide, which is biotic factors. So biotic factors, so we're thinking live things, abiotic, not alive, biotic, live. So we have seed dispersal, so think squirrels and corvids are things like crows. You can think all sorts of these kinds of birds and things that eat the seeds and they will poop out the seeds everywhere. And fructivores, so things that eat fruits. So yeah, these squirrels and these birds, they will eat all these things and they'll poop all the seeds out everywhere, or sometimes they'll bury the seeds. They are great for seed dispersing. Pollination, of course, we need our pollinators hitting those fruits or hitting those flowers to even make the fruits. Herbivory, so biotic factors, I mean, they're not always helpful. So herbivory is kind of knocking back the things that the deer are going and munching on those nice apical meristems, generally those latent bud or those exposed buds, because that's actually where a lot of the nutrients are stored in the twig. So of course, deer are going to come and bite that meristem where all the nutrients are, which they'll set that back quite a lot. Soil microbes. So mycorrhizae are soil-associated fungi. They attach into roots. They send out their fungal little hyphae, as they call them, which look like little squiggly root tissues, and they'll pierce into the root. And they're actually really helpful because root tissues can only get so small, but fungal tissue can actually get quite a lot smaller. So you get this kind of shoestring effect off of the roots. And that kind of helps expand the mass of the roots. The roots give the mycorrhizae a little bit of the nutrients, and the mycorrhizae gives the tree a lot more water collection. Then we also move into pests. So we get like the caterpillar, defoliators, native or invasive, and all sorts of other insect pests. Diseases, lots of biotic diseases. Bacterial leaf scorch, for example, vascular wilts. Then we have non-native invasive species. These are a very classic and a very modern issue. Just that little symbol there, the bamboo. I'm sure everyone's seen a thick bamboo forest. But we also have pests and diseases. Everyone's seen the stink bugs, the little brown marmorated one. That's an example of a non-native invasive insect. All right. We'll go on to the next slide. All right, so trees grow where they have a competitive advantage dealing with stress. So in the cypress swamp, we're going to get a lot of bald cypress because those bald cypress have these little kneecaps, as you see in there, where they can do that kind of gas exchange in the water. And a lot of the other trees are not going to be successful there because they don't have these special tissues to be doing the gas exchange underwater. And we'll go into the next slide because this will tie right in. So this is a big hill here. The gray thing is bedrock. The brown is kind of that soil. So we get to the top of the hill, And we see the soil is much thinner up top, and we're kind of a ridge species. These are dry, thin, infertile, rocky soils. What we call xeric, which is dry. Meanwhile, hydric is full of water. Looks like it just froze there for a second. Mid-slope is that just right condition. It's got that high water content, high nutrient content, with that kind of perfectly thin soil. So if we get to the top species, we're thinking like a lot of these ridge top species are like our oaks and mountain laurel and these kinds of things that are grow in these highly acidic, eroding sites with very thin soils. Meanwhile, our mid-slope species, we actually see a ton of invasives here, because you might imagine that invasives often conquer because they can reproduce so quickly. And so sites that would offer a lot of nutrients to do quick reproduction will be taken over by things that can reproduce the quickest. So that mid-slope is kind of that area we're going to see a lot of the invasives, because it's that perfectly fertile area where there's a lot of competition and they're adapted to compete. And then you get to the bottom here and you get that thick, wet anoxic. Anoxic meaning lack of oxygen. So when you get too much water, you deprive things of oxygen. Think that cypress swamp. So you're getting like your black willow and your cypress, and you're only getting things that can really grow in those wet conditions. So top of the hill, thin, dry, and infertile. Bottom of the hill, kind of that wet, anoxic, swampier species. And middle is that just right zone where everything thrives. All right. Sunlight, tree age, tree eye diameter. So thinking back, assuming that we have the best conditions, we're mid-slope. The more sunlight, and the more water access and the more all of that, you're going to get bigger growth. So if you look at these two tree rings here, the one on the left, you can see the rings are way larger. They're like, Lindsay, I don't know if you can point to that one on the left, maybe like that third ring that's really large. Yeah, that one's it's just huge, while the one on the right, you can't even see the rings. A lot of them are very small. So likely that one on the left got a lot of sunlight, got a lot of nutrients. It was probably a dominant crown class. And while that one on the right was likely something like in a suppressed crown class, it didn't have the things to kind of grow out, put as much on that secondary meristem to put out that width during the season. All right, we'll go to the next one. And we'll go into fire adaptations. So fire adaptations, fire can be really helpful for some species. A lot of species like need it to complete their life cycle. There's very few in Virginia that need it to complete their life cycle. So we can think like kind of a western area, kind of the giant sequoias, the jack pine, which is this really gnarly looking pine with big spikes on their pine cone. But it's their pine cones are sealed with the resin, and it needs a fire to come through and melt that resin for all the seeds to come out. So we also get these kind of the soil kind of gets refilled once you burn off all this these small tissues. So a lot of the time the fires aren't going through the crowns of the trees on our side, so you aren't going to kind of get any of that breaking up of cone resin. But we are going to kind of get that nice refreshing of the soil. A lot of those small grassy things get burned over and all those nutrients go into the soil. Yep, and so this picture here is actually talking about the sequoia that needs fire to run back through to actually regerminate. All right, so we'll move through. And then we got these, we can look at fire adaptation just on bark. So on the left here, we have something, a hard pine, likely something like a loblolly pine or something. Yeah, it's loblolly pine. And then we got kind of likely an oak in the center here. And then we have a red maple on the right. So these really thin bark species that'll definitely be killed off by these high heat events, killing off that tissue because it doesn't have that for any protection, to that kind of medium species that can definitely survive a fire event with some minimal damage. And then we have on the left kind of this There's a loblolly pine species that's fire adapted. It really likes having fire. It's got enough bark that you can burn through the bark and not kill off that that tissue inside. So this is kind of fire ecology. We'll go to the last one slide here, and then I'm going to throw it off to Lindsey after taking some questions. So this last slide, this is a pretty important one. Climate change and tree biology. So if we just think about only elevated CO2, I don't know what the special topic is this year, but if it is climate change, this is helpful. Generally, it's always related in some way. Elevated CO2, you'll kind of get trees like CO2. It's never a limiting factor, but the more CO2 you can get it if you have enough sunlight and all that, you're going to increase all your cellular respiration. However, all biological things kind of have a limiting temperature at some point. So if we happen to, that CO2 will eventually heat up, and that actually will decrease photosynthesis because you'll actually kind of get a burnout effect. You'll only get an increase of 20% instead of 50%, and so that cellular respiration will go up because you're going to start. Oh, wonderful. Okay. Renewable resources for sustainable future. So I guess we can relate this to using wood, timber in building materials. Increase in photosynthesis is going to actually increase the amount of that secondary ring tissue that and it's going to make it really you're going to get kind of a weaker wood because it's going to grow a little slower, but you're going to get it really quickly. And that'll actually have a decreased water usage. While the other side, you're going to increase your water usage while you're already limited by a lot of these. Well, as we heat up, we're going to start losing a lot of this fresh water. So you're increasing the cellular respiration, you're decreasing the photosynthesis. You're actually getting a lot of tighter rings, and it's really going to hurt in the long run. All right. So I'm going to take questions on all the biology section here. I'll run through. Let's see. I'm going to go with the first question I see here. How does smoke chemistry affect germination? We able to go back to the fire slide. Smoke chemistry isn't going to particularly affect. Yeah. It goes into that whole soil cycling part. How do I explain this? Shoot. I can get back to that one. I'm having a little bit of a blank mind. I apologize. I will jump back to it once I get something running through there. Actually, can we jump to the abiotic factors page? That is 16. Do you have an example question related to abiotic and biotic factors? What was the tree type bark for the far right file? Oh, that's two questions. Okay. So an abiotic biotic factors question could be simply list 5 abiotic factors, list 3 biotic factors, and you could simply do that. And it also could be list those factors and explain how they relate to tree growth, tree germination, forest management. So kind of going into, you can kind of think like fire is going to kind of reduce competition. There's temperatures needed for germination. Actually, if you can click one slide forward, we can click into biotic factors too. Herbivory's kind of got to knock back some tree growth. Pollination's required to set seeds for the future for seed dispersal. Pests and non-native invasives are going to suppress this forest growth. So if you think about these concepts, it could be also herbivory is an example of blank factor, abiotic or biotic, and so I have to answer that. Where non-native species are a blank factor. Let's see. So if we go to the pictures of the loblolly pine bark fire adaptation, 22. What was the type of bark for the one on the far right? So the one on the far right, that red maple, is that non-fire adapted species. It's that species that will get kind of killed off in that fire. It's our red maple, that very thin bark species, a classic. Let's see. Does anyone else have any additional questions for tree biology? Killing Lindsey on time. I apologize. All right. I'm going to let it go to her so I don't take any more of her time.
Okay, can you see the screen and hear me? Oh, I can't see any of you, so I need a verbal response.
Yes, we can.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to cover the sustainable forest management part of this. I'll try to go as fast as possible. So if you have any questions afterwards, let me know, whether that's email or if we have time for questions. I'm not going to really go over the learning objectives, except I'm going to point out things that I'm likely to hit. So number one, the definition of silviculture, I feel like is pretty important. Also, all the silvicultural systems that we'll go over today. I think that's pretty important to know. Forestry tools, I'll probably hit pretty hard today, and forest health and management. Understand how the following issues are affected by forest health and management. Yeah, so but how we get biodiversity, forest fragmentation, forest health, et cetera, and then I think ecosystem services is here. Yeah, understanding economic, social, and ecological factors as they pertain to forest management. So those are the main things I'm gonna try to hit. Okay, so to start off, silviculture and forest management. The definition of silviculture, I feel like it's a word that not too many people hear from day to day. So here's the basic definition that the U.S. Forest Service actually gives. So silviculture is the art and science of controlling the establishment, growth, composition, health, and quality of forests and woodlands to meet the diverse needs and values of landowners and societies such as wildlife habitat, timber, water resources, restoration, and recreation on a sustainable basis. That's a lot. So I highlighted some key things that I think are like the main takeaways of this definition. So silviculture is the art and science of controlling and establishing, and we can shorten the next few words to controlling and establishing the forest. So we're controlling the forest for what? We're controlling the forest for the diverse needs and values of landowners or stakeholders. And in case there's any confusion, I'll use stakeholders as anybody who has basically an importance in that land. So you guys could all be stakeholders in if you live around a park that you frequent a lot. So I'll use it in that kind of way. It's not just the people that own the land, but I'll talk about landowners specifically a lot today. So you're controlling the forest for diverse needs and values on a sustainable basis. So this means we're not just looking at the next 5 years. We're looking at the years and years and years. We're trying to make this forest to last for generations and not just manage it for ourselves. So hopefully that makes sense. We're going to keep moving on. Let's make this right here. Okay, so essentially the first part of that definition was controlling the forest. How do we control the forest, or how do we manage our forest? Forest management is really just about space and managing for space. What does that space allow? It allows the trees to access sunlight, water, and nutrients, the three basics of how a tree can grow. In a rural forest, so like in a for example, like 10 acres up forest, this competition is with other trees. So they're competing for space with other trees. In an urban forest, which we probably all live near, they are competing with other trees. If it's like a street tree and they're two next to each other in a very small space, and they're competing for all the nutrients in that little space. Buildings, hardscapes such as roads and stuff. I bet we've all seen trees like digging underneath pavement and stuff. That's competing for space because they do need room for their roots to grow out, because that's what stabilizes them and also helps them get their water and nutrients. Utilities, stormwater facilities, fields, because fields actually have, the grass in fields is competition. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. It's not just other trees, it is other plants that are also looking for the same thing. And aesthetics, such as lawns, I mentioned fields, it's pretty similar. Lawns, though, I feel like it's also referencing the, how do I say this? The aesthetics that people are used to seeing in their lawns. So if a tree starts to grow, it's probably going to get weed whacked immediately if it's in somebody's yard. So it's not going to be allowed that space at all. Oh, no. Oh, do that. Okay. So we're gonna backtrack back to rural forestry. And so I just mentioned how we are managing for space. So we know how we're gonna manage them. We're gonna allow trees space, but how do we even know what trees we're providing space for? What's a good tree? What's a bad tree? How old do we want them to be? Do we want them to be super young? What are we even looking for? So this is just a list of things, like qualities in trees that you can like manage, or you can select to manage for. So chronological characteristics, so we could manage for old trees, young trees. We could manage for existing trees or the future trees. Species, some species are way better on the market, so you may want more money, so you may manage for like hardwoods and stuff. Well, I guess that's not truly. You may manage for certain species that would do better commercially, or if you're really into like turkeys, or like, what is that bird called? A quail, I think. Yeah, quail or bears or something like that. You can manage your forest for habitat value as opposed to commercial. Oh, you can also manage for form. So different trees have different forms. And some forms are better for commercial value, some are better for habitat value. The example that this gives is large trees are really good for eagle nests, since they're large birds, so they need large trees to handle the nests. So that's a really good example. Okay, so we know that we need to manage for space, and we know that we have to choose what characteristics we're looking for in trees. So that's a lot to kind of manage in your head of like, do I want young trees or do I want old trees? Like, how do I know what I even want? So I think the first step to creating a forest management plan is to create goals or objectives. So in the last slide, I mentioned commercial, you want to sell your timber. And then there's another option of maybe you want it to have it for habitat, or maybe you just want to have a really pretty forest so you can have walking trails through it. Those are all goals or objectives. So throughout this, I'll probably talk about like habitats slash also logging a lot. So those are two very common goals and objectives. They are not always contradictory. You can do them at the same time. You can split your forest up into parts, or you can try to manage it in similar areas. There's ways to do it. But setting that initial goal so you know what steps you need to take next is very important. So we have our goal. Now we need to know what we even have in our forest, because I can't just say, I want to manage for turkey, and then think, I'm going to go plant a bunch of oaks, and I have a complete forest of already oaks. That doesn't make sense. So you need to backtrack a little bit and know what you have currently. And so that tells you where you need to go. So this includes data collection and analysis. This helps you figure out what you're missing to create your goal or objective. Also, forestry takes time. So a plan isn't just in the next year, we are going to manage 100 acres of forest to feed a whole flock of turkeys that aren't even there right now. It's not a now thing. It's within the next 50 years, a lot of the time, this is how this is our goal for the forest. So it's not a right here, right now, it's a looking for the future, which brings in the silviculture definition again of sustainable management. I love this picture because it's just a blurry thumb and a prism. So when you're collecting data, there's a few data points that you can look for that we commonly take, such as species, diameter at breast height, stocking / density. So that's like how many trees there are per an acre, or how much volume of wood there is per an acre, growth rate and age. So I'm not going to explain that picture yet, actually. So usually to collect this data, we do a walkthrough or a site visit of the forest, and we take plots throughout the forest. There's two ways that you can take plots: a fixed radius or a variable radius. The fixed radius is, say you have the map of the forested area right in front of you. I'm going to draw a grid and say it's 100 acres, so I break it into like 100 plots or 50 plots or whatever. In each of those little squares, I will be taking all the data above. The thing is, though, we are not taking data on every single tree in a forested stand. One, that takes way too much time. And two, just to analyze that data, we could get it faster by having something that filters the data for us. So that prism in that picture, that's one of the tools that we use. It tells us whether trees are in or out of our plot. So let's go back to that fixed plot. Well, it's a various plot radius technically. So prisms are used for variable radiuses, which means I can just walk through the forest, kind of drop a plot, pull out my prism and start jotting down trees that are in. I know whether a tree is in or not based on, let's look at the picture. So this tree would technically, it's actually really close. I'm gonna say it's in for the sake of the example because it is kind of in. Yeah, I would say that's in. So the way you know is if the chunk is touching, how do I explain this? Because I don't know if you guys, I'm pointing at it with my screen instead of my mouse. Okay, so if this section is touching the actual normal tree part, then it's in. But if it's completely out, so say if this chunk was over here, then it would be out. So that helps filter out some trees so we don't have to jot down every tree in every plot. I hope that makes sense. You can ask questions on that later because I know it's kind of a complicated thing. So that's for a variable radius. There's another tool that's also used for a variable radius. It's called a cruise all. It's a little metal bit that it'll be in a picture later. And I'll mention it. For the fixed radius plot, we actually use a distance. And it'll be a fixed distance for each and every one of those plots, depending on how big your plots are and how many of them are. That will determine how far out how big your plot is. So remember how I said you draw like a grid on your forest? And each of those squares, you'll drop a pin and then you'll walk that radius. And whatever tree is in that radius, that's what you're writing down. So it's kind of how we filter the data down a bit to be more manageable for us when we get back out of the field. Okay, so here are the tools that you use. In the picture before, that was the prism. So this one right here. This is a 10 basal area factor. They do have different factors. So you can move up and down the factor scale. It goes pretty high, but each prism only has one factor scale. So if I want to capture more trees, then I'll use a lower scale, like a 10. If I want to capture less and really big trees, then I'll go up to like 40 per se. So like I said, for the prism, you only, actually, what time is it? Oh my gosh. With the prism, you need different ones because only one prism holds one factor. But with the cruise all, so this is cruise all, they have different factors on them. These are the diameter tools. So a Biltmore stick, a logger's tape, and a logger's tape and a D tape. D tape only has diameter on it. Sometimes it also measures in tenths of a foot. Logger's tape is very similar, diameter by the inch and tenths of a foot a lot of the time. Make sure you look at what the measurement is because it's not usually inches for just the plain measurements, not the diameter. And a Biltmore stick does diameter in inches also. Biltmore stick can also be used for height. But another thing that can be used for height is a clinometer. There's electric versions and there are just, I don't even know what to call it because it's just a normal one for me, a normal clinometer. So these, the way that they work, they also can measure slope actually because they just work off basic trigonometry. So you can use them to measure both height and slope. Tree age. So instead of cutting down a tree to get a tree cookie, to count the rings and figure out how old it is, this is a increment borer. So what you do is you drill into the tree and then you count the rings. It'll produce like a little straw, basically of wood, and you can count the rings on the straw and that'll tell you how old the tree is, as opposed to killing the tree. So we're going to talk about the Biltmore stick because it's pretty important to Envirothon as a whole. Once again, so it does measure diameter. It also can measure saw timber, height, and logs, and also it helps with the conversions to pulp timber height in feet. And basically a Biltmore stick is used for everything for cruising. Cruising is finding out how much marketable timber there is on a plot. So I should be able to get height and diameter, which will tell me the volume. And then a lot of the times you'll tell a buyer how much volume you have in board feet. So using all that information you got with the diameter and the height, you can give a buyer a board feet, and they can give you an estimate on how much money you can get from that stand. Okay, so here are the, okay, we can do this. Regeneration cut is also just another word for, let me back up. Space management techniques. So these are ways that we can manage space in the forest. So a lot of this has to do with removing trees. A regeneration cut, for example, is another word for clear cut. So you're basically removing all trees in that area. A seed tree cut is removing most of the trees in an area, but leaving really good trees to reseed the area naturally, as opposed to like planting it back. A shelter wood is kind of similar to a seed tree, but you're leaving a little bit more trees, because instead of leaving those trees for seed tree purpose, you're using them as protection for the new trees that will grow up. So if, for example, it's a species that's not really the most full sun tolerant, they'll need a bit of shade to get going, then you can use a shelter wood. If it's a really windy area and you want them to be protected, you can use a shelter wood. Thinning from below can be used when you want to focus on larger trees or older trees, because all those little trees that are competing with them, so you can get rid of them by thinning from below. A basic thinning could be unwanted trees, trees with that form, a certain species, if that's not really the species that you're looking for. It could be invasive species, stuff like that. And a thinning isn't every tree, it's wherever the select tree you don't really want is. So it's a lot more sparse than the ones above it. A single tree selection is looking at a tree and being like, okay, this one. So it's usually for opening up large. So if there's a really mature tree and it's taking up a lot of area and it's covering a lot of the canopy, then a single tree selection would probably be what you want. If you think it's a less productive older tree and it's probably on its way out already, you can take it out ahead of time, so those trees below it can take that opportunity to grow sooner than it would have if you just let it die naturally. A patch cut or a patch clear cut, or a wildlife opening, it's also called a group select, there's a lot of names for this one, is basically just a clear cut but in specific areas. So it's not probably like acres on acres densely, it's sparsely. So like it'll be like an acre here or half an acre here. And you could do that for, it's a lot of times it's used for wildlife. If you want like prairies or like little grasslands within your forest, it's really good for that. So the order of these is in order of how not invasive, that's not the word I want to use, how heavy the cuts are. So a regeneration cut or a clear cut is the most thorough cut. And the patch tree, the group select, I tried to move it, I guess it didn't save. But single tree selection is the least invasive. And if you can put all the select thinnings or group selects all together, they're pretty similar, and how not invasive, I gotta stop saying that, how thorough they can be. But I would move the group select up one, but then they are in order of how heavy they are. Oh, right at 6, huh? Okay. Let's see. I'm gonna skip some. Jacob kind of talked about fires, so I want to talk about problems with forest management. We in urban areas, and rural areas, one of the most heavy problems that we're dealing with right now is deer browse and non-native invasive plants. They take up a lot of room, and the deer, Jacob was talking about herbivory being one of the things that trees have to overcome, because they really just love eating baby trees. So it's something that we're fighting, or the forests have to fight to get through. Non-native invasive. Okay, I think that covers those two things. So deer browse and non-native invasive plants are two of the major problems in forest management. Remember that. This is just an explanation. Another problem is parcellation or fragmentation. So this is, say, an owner owns 100 acres of straight forest. It's forest through and through. They sell it as 5 separate properties. So now it's 20-acre, 5 smaller properties. And all of those have different people managing them now. So say one person wants the money, so they clear cut it immediately because they need the money for something right now. And another person really likes lawns, and they're like, I want a lawn in my front yard, and I'm gonna make it at least 10 acres, half of it. So this kind of fragmentizes where the forest is. So it's not just a straight corridor for wildlife and even for like seeds. So good seed doesn't cover that same area that it did before, and now it's probably gonna fragmentize where certain trees can grow, because jumping over 20 acres is a lot more than having being a neighbor to where you dropped your seed before. That didn't make sense, but I'll try to explain it better if it comes up later. Aging service. So these are all important, but closing of mills is a very big thing, and loggers, there are a lot less loggers today, just because it has been a family practice a lot. And as generations go on, some people don't want to take on their family job of running the mill or being a logger. It can be a very dangerous job. So we're kind of losing those service providers, and with mills closing, sometimes you have to drive further to sell your timber. So that's another incentive to just not go through with things like logging and stuff. And also, Jim always used to like to note that Nova traffic was also a very big reason why loggers did not come into this area, that driving one of those trucks is not fun. What's after this? Okay. Not in my backyard. Not in my backyard, or NIMBY, is a social issue basically of where people who have the money and resources / time can basically lobby for things not to be in their area. So say if there is a large area to be cleared and it's behind a more prominent area of status, then they could lobby for it to be put elsewhere, or for them to log elsewhere. So a lot of the times you see not clear cuts, but a lot of development going on in places where they don't have the time or resources and money to lobby for those things. Changing markets. I'm gonna keep going. Oh, why is this here? I'm gonna keep going because I know I'm running out of time. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. So urban forests you can cut me off whenever you need to also.
I was just going to say, you should feel free to take your time because you're covering really good material. You don't need to rush.
Okay.
You're totally fine. And no, it's great. It's great. This is really good stuff. Thank you.
Awesome. I'll backtrack if you guys have any questions later, especially since I know I skipped so much. But urban forest benefits. Urban forests are something that are kind of new, and especially they're new to like research and people like actually caring about them and promoting them, instead of just doing like a tree here or there. There's a lot of places in Northern Virginia that help promote and even require having urban forests after development kind of clears a lot of the land. Getting that green space is really important because it also has like monetary benefits as well as mental benefits to people. So for example, it lowers energy costs through shading. If trees shade houses, then you will probably have to use less cooling in the summer. Higher property values because people like trees. So if they see an area with trees and like nice greenery, they're more likely to think it's a nice place or want to live there, because who doesn't like trees? Also, let's start input. So trees also uptake fertilizer. There's a lot of fertilizers being used in urban areas, and trees help take them up. They also help take up and hold not pesticides, pollution. Geez, they help hold pollution. They also absorb water, so they reduce flooding a lot of the time. I know we've gotten a lot of rain recently, so you've probably seen like a lot of erosion happening just because it was such a really quick storm, and we haven't had water. Well, we've been getting more water, but we haven't had good amounts of water in a while. So trees help reduce the amount of erosion and flooding that we have. They also help integrated pest management, because if you actually look at the trees that you have in your area, they can tell you what's in your area, like pest-wise. So if you have like scales, or if you have spawner and lanternfly, the trees will help tell you that. You just have to pay attention to them. They also help reduce stress, and they add better health to people. So just a lot of mental benefits. There are a lot of things to combat when being an urban tree. That was a weird way to say that, but compacted soil or restricted soil volume are two really important ones. So you probably stepped on dirt or soil, sorry, and it's felt probably as hard as pavement. That's compacted soil. This means that there's less air in the soil, and less air also means less space for water. But roots also do need air to go through all the systems that they have. So less air and water in soil is not a good thing. It's a stressor. Restricted soil volume, that's just less soil in general. So if you have less soil, and that small amount of soil also has less air and water in it, that's two heavy stressors that can go on a tree. Microclimates is things like parking lots are really just heat islands for trees. All of that heat just radiating back to trees. You can also get windows can bounce sun off of them and like burn trees sometimes. It's really interesting to see, because you'll look at a tree and be like, what is that? And then if you're there often enough, you can actually see it happening over like a period of a summer. It's very interesting. Poor drainage, since the soils are usually really, I'm pretty sure we've all seen like the red clay in our area. Our red clay holds water really well. And when it's compacted, it holds less water, and it still holds it just as well. And holding water is great, but it's also, our clays are really sticky. They're known to like not give up much water. So there's like a threshold where there's too little water and this clay is holding on to it so powerful that the trees actually can't get to it. So it's not accessible water. So that's poor drainage. Ooh, that's not poor drainage. It is poor drainage. No, it's not. Okay, but that is another problem. But poor drainage is the compacted soil doesn't actually leach water into it much. So sometimes you'll just see water sitting on top of it. That's not great, because a lot of our trees, or some of the trees that are planted in urban areas, aren't really built to have that much water just sitting on them. It can cause root rot and stuff like that. So that's another stressor to be added on. Mechanical damage is weed whackers and mowers hitting up against it, and bad management, such as bad mulching or bad pruning. Bad pruning can allow diseases and stuff to get into the branches if you do it wrong. Mulching, if you mulch too high, it's called volcano mulching, then you can actually encourage trees to grow roots within like the tower of mulch that you've built. And there's not much room in that tower of mulch, so the roots keep bouncing around and around, and there is stem there, so they're bouncing around and around the stem, and eventually as the tree grows, those roots will choke it eventually, which is called tree something. What is that called? Girdling. Yeah, it's called girdling. So that's why proper mulching techniques are so important. I'm gonna skip these. Okay, so ecosystem services are essentially all of the things that we get from the ecosystem, or I'm gonna stick to forest really in this case. So there are 4, it's provisioning, cultural, regulatory, and supporting. Provisioning and cultural, I think, are the 2 easier ones to grasp, so I'll go over those first. Provisioning is like wood fibers, game. Oh, like hunting and stuff, because you're hunting in the woods. Those woods allow you access for wildlife that like being in woods, so game. Non-wood products such as mushrooms, floral supply, ginseng, things that grow in the forest that you really wouldn't have the opportunity to get if we didn't have forest around us. And water quantity, so not water quality, the amount of water instead. Because basically anything that you can intake or buy or purchase, that is a provisioning service. Cultural, on the other side, is things that you kind of experience. So the hiking, the camping, it could be religious, it could be aesthetics. Existence is a funny one. And tourism is a good example. Now on to the 2 other ones, regulating and supporting. So regulating is all of the things. How do I say this? I was trying to explain this to Jacob in a good way. So I practice. Okay, so supporting, I say supporting is usually all of the cycles or systems that then create all the other services. So supporting is really the linchpin that holds everything else together. So it'll be photosynthesis, pollination, soil creation, water cycle, and nutrient cycle. And a lot of those products are kind of just stuck directly into regulating services. So our water cycle gives us good water quality. Nutrient cycling gives us carbon storage and soil management. So it's kind of like a 1-to-1. And then if you take regulating things one step further and compound them, it gives you our provisioning and cultural. Hopefully that made sense. I can explain that in different ways if I try. But those are our 4 main ones. So you'll see how supporting's in the middle. And I think that's a good way to think about it because it just supports all of the other services that the forest provides to us. Ooh, yes. Okay. And we did it.